These are the most brutal WWE injuries that ended careers, some instantly, others after years of pain, and it all started with one suplex that nearly left a champion paralyzed. March 11th, 2022. WWE SmackDown. Big E, one of WWE's most popular superstars, was in a tag team match against Ridge Holland. It was just another night in the ring. Then, everything went wrong. Holland went for a belly-to-belly suplex outside the ring. It was a move Big E had taken many times before, but this time, he didn't land right. Instead of flipping over, he crashed headfirst onto the ground. The crowd gasped. Big E wasn't moving. Trainers and doctors rushed to his side. He was put on a stretcher, and as they carried him out, he managed to lift his hand and give a thumbs up. The fans cheered, hoping he was okay. But behind the scenes, the truth was scary. Doctors found 2 broken bones in his neck, his C1 and C6 vertebrae. The good news? He didn't need surgery. The bad news? If the break had been just a little worse, he could have been paralyzed forever. That was 2 years ago. Today, Big E still hasn't been cleared to wrestle. His C1 vertebra hasn't healed completely, and there's a real chance he may never wrestle again. But at least Big E was able to walk away. The next wrestler on this list, he never walked again. December 1990, a small, untelevised WWF event. Chuck Austin wasn't a big name. He wasn't even a trained wrestler. He was just a rookie fill-in, stepping into the ring to make the stars look good. That night, he teamed up with another unknown against the Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty. For Austin, this was supposed to be his big break, but instead, it was the last time he would ever walk. The match was going as planned until Jannetty set him up for his finishing move, the Rocker Dropper. A simple move. Jannetty jumped, landed with his leg across Austin's neck, and expected him to take a flat bump on the mat. But Austin had never been trained on how to take the move properly. And then it happened. Austin's head hit the mat at the worst possible angle. His neck snapped instantly. He collapsed, completely motionless. At first, nobody realized how serious it was. The match ended, and Austin lay there on the mat. Then panic set in. He couldn't move his arms, he couldn't move his legs. Trainers and doctors rushed to the ring. The realization hit fast. Chuck Austin was paralyzed. The diagnosis? A broken neck and severe spinal cord damage. He would never walk again. Years later, Austin took WWF to court, claiming they had never properly trained him. In 1994, he won a $26.7 million lawsuit, though WWF later settled for a smaller amount, but no amount of money could change what happened that night. One move, one mistake, and Chuck Austin's life changed forever. And if you think that's brutal, the next superstar on this list was a rising WWE star, until a freak injury made him disappear forever. January 2018, Jason Jordan was on top of the world. A former NXT Tag Team Champion, a rising star on Monday Night Raw, and the on-screen son of Kurt Angle. He was being groomed for a massive push. Then, out of nowhere, his body started failing him. It wasn't one big injury. There was no single moment where everything went wrong. But after a routine tag match, something felt off. Jordan started feeling a sharp pain in his neck. Then his grip weakened. He couldn't lift his arms the same way. He tried to push through it, but the pain only got worse. And then his strength started disappearing. Doctors ran tests, and the news was devastating. He had a serious neck injury, a herniated disc pressing on his spinal cord. Surgery was the only option. WWE pulled him from TV, but at first, fans thought it was just part of a storyline. He had been written off Raw after a heated moment with his father, Kurt Angle. Nobody realized it at the time, but that wasn't just an angle, it was the end of his career. On February 6, 2018, Jason Jordan underwent neck surgery. WWE was hopeful he'd return, but months passed, then a year. Jordan never came back. His condition never improved enough for WWE to clear him. He quietly transitioned into a backstage producer role, helping plan matches instead of wrestling in them. He was 29 years old, a career that should have lasted a decade, gone in an instant. But as sudden as Jason Jordan's exit was, the next superstar on this list saw his career slipping away for years before it finally ended. August 3rd, 1997, SummerSlam. Steve Austin was about to win the Intercontinental Championship against Owen Hart. He was red hot on his way to becoming WWE's biggest biggest star. Then, one move nearly ended everything. Owen set Austin up for a tombstone pile driver, a move that, when done correctly, should have been safe, but Owen made one small mistake. Instead of dropping to his knees, he dropped to his butt. Austin's head was too low. He landed directly on his neck. The moment he hit the mat, Austin couldn't feel his arms or legs. For a terrifying few seconds, he thought he was completely paralyzed. The match was still going, but Austin couldn't move. Somehow, he managed to crawl on top of Owen and roll him up for a weak-looking pin. The crowd cheered, but backstage, everyone knew something was wrong. Doctors diagnosed him with a bruised spinal cord and severe nerve damage. Against all odds, Austin returned to action just 2 months later, but his neck was never the same. For the next 6 years, the damage kept getting worse. His hands started going numb, the pain never stopped, and by 2003, doctors gave him the final warning. One more bad bump could paralyze him for life. That was it. At WrestleMania 19, Austin wrestled The Rock in what would be his last match. His career was over at age 38. For nearly 2 decades, Austin stayed retired. No comebacks, no one-night returns. He was done until WrestleMania 38. 19 years after his retirement, Austin shocked the world by stepping back into the ring for a no-holds-barred match against Kevin Owens. Fans expected a quick brawl, maybe a stunner, but Austin went all out. He fought, took bumps, and even took a suplex on the outside. For one night only, Stone Cold was back. It was a perfect send-off, proving he could still go, but it was also proof of why he retired in the first place. Austin walked away on his own terms, but the next WWE legend on this list, he didn't get that choice. April 3rd, 2011. WrestleMania 27. Edge, the reigning World Heavyweight Champion, was at the top of his game. That night, he defended his title against Alberto Del Rio and won. Fans had no idea they were watching his last match, because just days later, doctors gave him the news that ended his career. Edge had always wrestled with a reckless style, spears, ladder matches, hardcore wars, but what fans didn't know was that he had already broken his neck once before. Back in 2003, Edge underwent neck fusion surgery to fix damage that had built up over years of high-impact wrestling. The surgery saved his career, but it wasn't a permanent fix. By 2011, Edge was dealing with numbness in his arms. His hands would tingle. His grip was getting weaker. After WrestleMania 27, WWE doctors ran tests, and what they found was terrifying. Spinal stenosis, a condition where the spinal canal narrows, putting pressure on the spinal cord. One bad bump and Edge could have been paralyzed. The decision wasn't up to him. Doctors refused to clear him. On the April 11th, 2011 episode of Raw, Edge stood in the ring and told the fans, "I have to retire." At just 37 years old, his career was over. For the next 9 years, Edge stayed retired. He moved on, acted in TV shows, made special WWE appearances, but never wrestled. Every doctor told him the same thing. You can't come back, until he did. In 2019, Edge underwent more tests, and for the first time, doctors gave him hope. With more surgeries and cutting-edge rehab, he was finally cleared. And at the 2020 Royal Rumble, after 9 years away, Edge returned. It was one of the most shocking comebacks in WWE history. He went on to wrestle full-time for the next 3 years, before leaving WWE in 2023. His story had a happy ending, but for years, Edge believed he'd never step in the ring again. The next superstar on this list wasn't so lucky. His career ended before it even had a chance to begin. Most WWE fans know Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, but what many don't know is that his son, Richie Steamboat, was supposed to follow in his footsteps, and for a while it looked like he would. By 2012, Richie was one of the top prospects in WWE's developmental system, FCW, Florida Championship Wrestling, the company's training ground before NXT became what it is today. He had the perfect look, the talent, the wrestling IQ, everything WWE wanted in a future star. His matches impressed legends. He was being groomed for the main roster. Then his back gave out. It wasn't one big injury. It was a gradual build-up of spinal damage. Years of taking bumps, high-flying moves, and hard landings finally caught up with him. The pain pain got worse. His movement became limited. Doctors found severe spinal issues that required multiple surgeries, and then WWE made the call. Richie Steamboat was quietly released in 2013. No farewell match, no big announcement. His career ended before it even started. Today, Richie stays out of the spotlight. He never wrestled again. Unlike his father, he never got his WrestleMania moment, just a dream that disappeared before it could come true. But while Richie's injury built up over time, the next superstar on this list, she was forced to retire in an instant. December 27th, 2017, a live WWE event at Madison Square Garden. Paige was back in action after missing over a year due to injuries. She had just returned as the leader of Absolution, a dominant new faction. It was supposed to be the start of her comeback. Instead, it was the end of her career. The match was a 6-woman tag, and at one point, Paige turned her back to Sasha Banks. It was a normal spot. Sasha went for a simple kick to the back, nothing dangerous, nothing out of the ordinary. But Paige wasn't ready. She took the kick at the worst possible angle. Her body whiplashed forward, and she collapsed to the mat. At first, she tried to get up, but something was wrong. She couldn't control her legs. The referee realized it instantly. He rushed over, throwing up the X sign, a signal that a real injury had happened. The match stopped. Trainers helped Paige out of the ring, and fans hoped it was just a minor setback. It wasn't. Doctors confirmed the worst. Her neck was in terrible shape. Years of damage had left it weak, and the whiplash from that one kick was enough to end her career. At just 25 years old, Paige was forced to retire. She broke down in tears on Raw, announcing she could never wrestle again. The crowd chanted her name, but she was devastated. Her in-ring career was over. For years, she stayed in WWE as a manager, an authority figure, and even a commentator. But deep down, she never gave up hope. And then a miracle happened. In 2022, after 5 years on the sidelines, Paige, now going by Saraya, was medically cleared to wrestle again. She signed with AEW, and at Full Gear 2022, she stepped back into the ring for the first time since that night. Her story had a comeback, but the next wrestler on this list, his career ended just as fast, without any second chances. Corey Graves was supposed to be one of the next big stars. He had the look, the attitude, and the skills to back it up. He had already won the NXT Tag Team Championships, and a main roster call-up was just around the corner. But then, the concussions started piling up. At first, it was just one, then another, then another. Each time, WWE doctors did more tests, and each time, the results got worse. The problem with concussions, they don't just heal like a broken bone. The more you get, the worse the effects. Corey started dealing with constant headaches, dizziness, memory loss, and doctors told him what no wrestler ever wants to hear. You can't be cleared to compete. That was it. His career was over before it even really began. The dream of making it to Raw or SmackDown, gone. The chance to main event WrestleMania, gone. At just 30 years old, Corey Graves was forced to retire, but instead of disappearing, he found a new path in WWE. Triple H saw something in him and offered him a spot on the NXT commentary team. Within a few years, Corey became one of the voices of WWE, eventually moving to Raw and SmackDown as a full-time commentator. For years, he accepted that he'd never wrestle again, but then everything changed. In 2022, after nearly 8 years away, Corey Graves was finally cleared for in-ring action. He trained, teased a comeback, and even hinted at stepping back into the ring, but so far he hasn't. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But one thing is for sure, his in-ring career was stolen from him before it ever reached its full potential. And while Corey's story had a second chance, the next name on this list, his wrestling career was over the moment his shoulder gave out. Wade Barrett should have been a world champion by now. He had the size, the look, the charisma. He had already won the King of the Ring, held multiple mid-card titles, and even led the infamous Nexus faction. But by 2016, his career wasn't skyrocketing. It was falling apart. Why? Injuries. Barrett's body had been breaking down for years. His shoulder was wrecked. He had suffered multiple dislocations, forcing him to miss huge chunks of time. Every time he built momentum, he got sidelined again. WWE lost faith in him. They stopped pushing him. He was reduced to a background role in the League of Nations, and by WrestleMania 32, it was clear he was done. Instead of sticking around, Barrett made the choice himself. In May 2016, he let his contract contract expire and walked away from WWE. For years, fans wondered if he would ever return to the ring. He kept the door open but focused on acting and commentary instead. Eventually, in 2020, he came back to WWE's NXT commentary desk. But wrestling, that part of his career was over. Barrett was one of WWE's biggest what-if stories. He had all the tools to be a top star, but his body just couldn't keep up. And as unlucky as Barrett was, the next man on this list was once a wrestling icon, until one day he couldn't move. Lex Luger was once one of the biggest stars in wrestling, a multi-time champion, a main eventer in WCW and WWE, and one of the most physically impressive wrestlers of his era. But then his body shut down. It didn't happen in the ring. There was no big match, no career-ending move. Instead, on October 19th, 2007, while preparing for an event, Luger suddenly lost feeling in his arms and legs. Out of nowhere, he collapsed. Doctors diagnosed him with a spinal stroke, a rare condition that caused severe nerve damage in his neck. He was completely paralyzed. For years, Lex Luger, once known for his incredible strength, was confined to a wheelchair. He had gone from wrestling the biggest names in the industry to struggling just to move. Over time, with therapy, he regained some mobility, but never wrestled again. Luger's story wasn't just about wrestling. It was about losing everything and fighting to survive. He found peace outside of the ring, turning his life around and inspiring others. But as heartbreaking as Luger's injury was, the next one on this list, it was nearly fatal. April 9th, 2017, New Japan Pro Wrestling's Sakura Genesis. Katsuyori Shibata was known for his brutal, hard-hitting style. He didn't just wrestle, he fought, and on that night, he took things too far. In the main event, Shibata faced Kazuchika Okada for the IWGP Heavyweight Championship. It was the biggest match of his career, and he was going all out. Stiff kicks, brutal slaps, and unprotected strikes. Then, he threw one headbutt too many. He reared back and slammed his skull into Okada's head with full force. The impact was sickening. Blood immediately started dripping down his forehead. The crowd gasped, but the match continued. Shibata fought through the pain, lasting another 15 minutes. He lost, but that wasn't the real story. Backstage, everything went wrong. He collapsed. He couldn't move. Doctors rushed him to the hospital, where they found a subdural hematoma bleeding in his brain. He underwent emergency surgery, and for a while his life was in danger. The doctors made it clear he could never wrestle again. Shibata was lucky to survive. He spent years in recovery, unable to train, unable to fight. But against all odds, in 2021, he did the impossible. He wrestled one last exhibition match in NJPW. Even so, his in-ring career as a full-time wrestler was over. And while Shibata's injury was the result of his brutal style, the next wrestler on this list, his career was stolen from him outside the ring. October 14th, 1986. Magnum TA was on the verge of superstardom. He was young, charismatic, and one of the top baby faces in the NWA, the man who was supposed to be the next Ric Flair. Fans saw him as the future of wrestling. Then it all ended in an instant. That night, Magnum was driving in rainy conditions in Charlotte, North Carolina. Suddenly, he lost control of his Porsche. The car spun off the road and crashed into a telephone pole. The impact was so violent that Magnum was trapped inside the wreckage for hours. When paramedics finally pulled him out, the reality set in. He was paralyzed. Doctors feared he'd never walk again. His wrestling career gone. At just 27 years old, the man destined to be NWA World Champion would never wrestle another match. Over the years, Magnum defied the odds. He eventually regained the ability to walk, but only with a cane. He stayed in wrestling as a mentor and behind-the-scenes figure, but his dream, it was over before it truly began. And while Magnum's career was tragically cut short, the next name on this list, his retirement came at the height of his success, and no one saw it coming. February 8th, 2016, Daniel Bryan stood in the middle of the ring, staring out at thousands of fans chanting his name. But this wasn't a celebration, it was a goodbye. Just 2 years earlier, Bryan was at the peak of his career. He had overcome every obstacle, fought against WWE's system, and made it to the main event of WrestleMania 30, winning the WWE Championship in one of the greatest moments in wrestling history. But behind the scenes, his body was breaking down. Years of hard-hitting matches had taken a toll. all. Bryan had suffered multiple concussions throughout his career, but the worst came in 2015. During a match on SmackDown, Bryan took a routine bump and suddenly something was wrong. At first he ignored it, but the symptoms got worse. Headaches, memory problems, trouble focusing. WWE sent him to doctors hoping it was just a minor issue, but the test showed something far worse. Doctors found a lesion on his brain. The damage was too severe. WWE's medical team refused to clear him. His career was over. On February 8, 2016, Bryan walked to the ring and announced his retirement from wrestling. Fans chanted, "Thank you, Bryan," but the reality was heartbreaking. At just 34 years old, one of the most beloved wrestlers of all time had to walk away. And just like that, Daniel Bryan's story was over. Or at least, that's what we thought. For 2 years, Daniel Bryan was stuck on the sidelines. He became the SmackDown general manager, trying to stay involved, but it wasn't the same. Every night he watched wrestlers do what he was born to do, and he couldn't take it, so he fought. Bryan traveled the country, meeting specialists, neurologists, brain experts, anyone who could prove WWE wrong. He changed his diet, his training, and even underwent experimental concussion therapy. Then, finally, he got the answer he had been waiting for. In 2018, doctors cleared him to wrestle. WWE had no choice but to let him return. And just like that, after years of thinking he was done, Bryan stepped back into the ring at WrestleMania 34. It was one of the greatest comebacks in wrestling history. But for every Daniel Bryan, there's a story that doesn't have a happy ending. Because some injuries don't just end careers, they leave you wondering how they survived. Take Tyson Kidd. One move, 1 second, and his career was over. The scariest part? He was lucky to be alive. And that's just one of the most terrifying injuries in WWE history. If you thought these were brutal, wait until you see the next list. Click here to watch the scariest injuries in WWE history.